When firewood disappears, the assumption is simple: warmth disappears with it. That belief feels intuitive because modern life has trained us to see heat as something we burn into existence. Fuel goes in, warmth comes out. But that assumption would have been foreign to much of human history. Across vast regions and long stretches of time, communities endured winters, shortages, and entire landscapes without dependable wood supplies. They did not simply survive. They engineered systems that made heat predictable, controllable, and, in many cases, independent of flame altogether. The deeper truth is that fire was only one part of a broader energy strategy. Heat could be stored, redirected, accumulated, or even grown. When wood failed, the system did not collapse, it adapted. What remains overlooked is not just the ingenuity of these methods, but how systematically they were integrated into daily life. They were not improvisations, they were infrastructure. This matters because the historical record does not show cold, defeating people when fuel ran out. It shows that heat, properly understood, rarely depended on fire alone. The assumption that fire equals heat has obscured how energy was actually managed. Fire is immediate. It is visible, measurable, and responsive. That makes it easy to mistake for the source of warmth rather than a tool for moving energy. Historically, this distinction shaped survival. In many pre-industrial societies, fire was inefficient when used in isolation. Open flames lost heat rapidly to the surrounding air. Large amounts of fuel were required to maintain a stable temperature, especially in poorly insulated spaces. Over time, this led to a shift in thinking. Instead of producing more heat, people began focusing on retaining and directing the heat they already had. This shift marked the difference between consumption and control. It also explains why regions with limited forests, steppelands, high altitudes, and arid zones developed some of the most sophisticated heating systems. They could not afford to waste energy. What followed was not a reduction in comfort, but a refinement of method. Stone, earth, and clay became the first true heat storage systems. Long before the language of thermodynamics existed, builders understood thermal mass through observation. Dense materials like stone, packed earth, and clay absorbed heat slowly and released it just as slowly. This property transformed structures into reservoirs of warmth. In ancient dwellings, walls were rarely passive barriers. They were designed to capture heat during the day, whether from sunlight, body warmth, or limited fires, and release it over the course of the night. Floors were often constructed with similar intent, compacted to retain energy and prevent rapid loss to the ground below. This approach is visible in a range of historical designs, from Roman hypocaust systems to traditional earthen homes across Central Asia. In each case, the principle remained consistent: generate heat once, store it effectively, and let the structure do the rest. The practical outcome was significant. A small, controlled heat source could maintain livable conditions for extended periods. In some cases, no continuous fire was required at all. Heat was guided and distributed rather than constantly recreated. Once heat could be stored, the next step was to control its movement. This is where many ancient systems begin to resemble engineered networks rather than simple shelters. Flues, channels, and underfloor passages allowed warm air to travel through a structure before exiting. Instead of rising and escaping immediately, heat was forced to interact with surfaces, transferring energy along the way. This increased efficiency dramatically. In East Asia, for example, underfloor heating systems directed smoke and hot air beneath living spaces before venting outside. The result was even, sustained warmth from minimal fuel input. Similar principles appeared elsewhere, adapted to local materials and conditions. What stands out is not just the technology, but the intention behind it. Heat was treated as something to be routed and conserved. Fire was only the beginning of the process. So, the sun functioned as a primary heat source when used deliberately. Firewood shortages often coincided with environmental constraints, but Sunlight remained constant. The challenge was not access, but utilization. Ancient builders oriented homes to maximize solar gain, particularly during colder months. South-facing walls, angled openings, and enclosed courtyards allowed sunlight to penetrate deeply into living spaces. Once inside, thermal mass materials absorbed and retained that energy. This method required precision. Too much exposure could lead to overheating during the day and rapid cooling at night. Successful designs balanced intake and retention, often incorporating shading elements that changed with the seasons. The result was a system where fire became supplementary rather than essential. In clear conditions, solar heat alone could maintain habitable temperatures. This was not theoretical. It was practiced consistently in regions where wood was scarce but sunlight abundant. The lesson is not simply that the sun provides heat, but that architecture determines whether that heat is usable. Biological processes were harnessed as steady, renewable heat sources. Decomposition generates heat. This is a basic biological process, but its controlled use as an energy source reflects a deeper understanding of natural systems. In agricultural societies, composting materials, plant waste, manure, and organic debris were sometimes integrated into or adjacent to living spaces. As these materials broke down, they produced consistent, low-level heat over extended periods. This approach did not replace other methods, but it contributed to a layered system of warmth. In cold climates, even a modest increase in ambient temperature could reduce the need for additional fuel. More importantly, this method required no combustion. It relied on cycles that were already part of daily life. Waste became a resource, and energy was generated as a byproduct of maintenance rather than consumption. This reflects a broader pattern in historical survival strategies. Efficiency was achieved not by increasing inputs, but by integrating systems. Fuel diversity ensured that no single resource determined survival. Firewood was never the only fuel, even when it was the preferred one. In treeless or deforested regions, alternatives were not temporary substitutes. They were primary resources. Dried animal dung, peat, agricultural residues, and even certain types of soil-based fuels were used extensively. Each had different burn characteristics, requiring adjustments in stove design and usage patterns. What is often overlooked is how these fuels were incorporated into long-term planning. Communities understood their availability, storage requirements, and seasonal variations. Fuel was managed as part of a broader ecological system. This diversification reduced vulnerability. When one resource became scarce, others could compensate. The system did not depend on a single point of failure. From a historical perspective, this approach aligns closely with later military doctrines emphasizing redundancy and supply chain resilience. The principle is the same. Survival depends on options. Cooking methods evolved to reduce reliance on active heat. Cooking is one of the most energy-intensive daily activities. Reducing its fuel demands had immediate benefits for survival. One solution was to shift from high-intensity, short-duration cooking to low-intensity, long-duration methods. Insulated containers, often buried or enclosed, allowed food to continue cooking after being briefly heated. This technique effectively stored thermal energy within the food itself. Once sealed, the system required no additional fuel. Over time, it produced fully cooked meals with minimal resource expenditure. This method appears in various forms across different cultures, adapted to local conditions and materials. What unites them is the underlying concept. Time can substitute for fuel. By extending the cooking process, energy demands were spread out and reduced. This not only conserved resources, but also aligned with other heat retention strategies. Layered systems created resilience by design, rather than by chance. No single method provided complete security. What made ancient heating strategies effective was their combination. A well-designed dwelling might incorporate thermal mass walls, solar orientation, controlled airflow, alternative fuels, and biological heat sources simultaneously. Each component addressed a different aspect of the problem. If one element failed, cloud cover reducing solar gain, for example, others compensated. The system adapted without collapsing. This layered approach mirrors principles seen in later strategic planning, where redundancy and flexibility are prioritized over efficiency alone. In both cases, the goal is not optimal performance under ideal conditions, but reliable performance under uncertain ones. The historical record suggests that this mindset was not accidental. It was the result of long-term observation and incremental improvement. The loss of these methods reflects a shift in thinking, not a lack of knowledge. Modern heating systems prioritize convenience and immediacy. Fuel is expected to be abundant, and energy is treated as a commodity rather than a constraint. This has led to a narrowing of perspective. As centralized energy systems expanded, localized knowledge became less relevant. Techniques that required careful design and maintenance were replaced by systems that required only access to fuel. Over time, the older methods were not disproven. They were forgotten. Their complexity made them less attractive in a context where simplicity and speed were valued. However, this shift also introduced new vulnerabilities. Dependence on single-source energy systems increases risk when those systems fail. In contrast, historical approaches distributed that risk across multiple strategies. The difference is not technological capability, but conceptual framework. Remembering these systems reveals how adaptable human survival has always been. The absence of firewood did not signal the end of warmth. It forced a re-evaluation of how heat was understood and used. What emerged from that process was not a workaround, but a comprehensive system of energy management. These methods demonstrate that survival is rarely about a single solution. It is about understanding relationships between materials, environment, and time, and using that understanding to create stability. They also challenge the assumption that progress always replaces what came before. In many cases, it simply obscures it. The value of revisiting these practices is not nostalgic. It is practical. They offer insight into how systems can function under constraint, how resilience can be built into everyday life, and how knowledge can persist even when resources do not. Heat never disappeared. It was always present, waiting to be captured, stored, and used with intention. If you value this kind of deeper historical analysis, the kind that looks beyond the surface and examines how people actually lived, adapted, and endured, consider subscribing to Hidden in History. And if this perspective added something useful to your understanding, share it with someone who appreciates the lessons history still has to offer.